What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of WagMe TV. Today, we're going to be covering Sui. It's a brand new L1 blockchain that's been making a ton of noise in the crypto kind of circles all around the web, and we're going to give you all the information you need to know. We're going to tell you what it is, why it's super unique, and we're going to answer the main question on everyone's mind, which is this the next Solana killer? Joined, as always, by the absolute fellas. We got the All-American, Ev Smith.
How we doing?
We got the NFT Lord himself, Alex Garcia. And we got the Doctor, Doc Mata. We're going to be breaking down the Sui blockchain, and we're going to honestly just get right into it. So, boys, what do we think about the feng shui?
I think we're pretty bullish on it. I think they got some pretty interesting parts of it. But yeah, let's dive into Sui. So we start on June 24th, 2021. Jerome Powell told Facebook that they couldn't continue the Libra project. And if you remember Libra, it was Facebook's initiative to create a stablecoin. So the Federal Reserve said no, and by January 2022, they had wound it down. But there was a lot of talented people at Facebook developing this technology. And in September 2021, Mistin Labs started. It doesn't sound like an important name. It doesn't sound like one that, would show up on the headlines of your local newspaper, but they're developing some pretty interesting technology. And out of it is coming Sui, a blockchain developed by Evan Cheng and 3 other Facebook executives. So Evan Chen worked at Apple for 6 years, where he wrote code that is in every modern iPhone. And then at Facebook, worked on Libra to build out the consensus layer on their Libra project, and also work on other R&D initiatives. A notable piece of technology that came out of this Libra project, later renamed to Diem, was the Move programming language. And just like Solidity or Rust, Move is a smart contract programming language with one of the notable highlights is a language ability for defining custom resource types. This is something that you don't really see in Solidity or Rust, and everything that lives on the blockchain is designed as an object. So when transactions on Sui are running with objects, they're independent of each other, and they can be executed in parallel. And that's a very important part, because it's one of the key differentiators of Sui. Another part is their backing. They've got great backing from some of the top funds in crypto. So their Series A was a $36 million round led by A16Z. And then pretty recently, they raised $300 million at a $2 billion valuation, led by FTX. So they've got great funding, they've got great runway, they've got founders that have been in the space. I think Evan Chen said since 2016, 2017. And it's a pretty interesting take on blockchain. So yeah, let's dive into, what makes it special.
I actually didn't know that they had that much funding. That's definitely something that stands out, I think. I didn't know the exact figures behind it, but that is some serious funding. I think what we always kind of consider when we look at, what's going to make these L1s stand out, we always come back to who's going to be developing on the platform. Having that type of funding allows you to have hackathons, have grant programs, have all these different ways of attracting developers to your platform. So thanks for taking us through that, Ev. I actually had no idea that they had that much funding in hand.
Yeah, honestly, that 300 million led by FTX was kind of what put Sui on the map for me. I don't know about you all, but I mean, they're off to a pretty good start with this, right? Of course, they have to come correct with the technology and make sure like everything's working correctly, but they've got really experienced founders. They've got the backing for it. So now they just have to go out and execute. And that's kind of what we'll get into here. Really, really briefly. So what is Sui in general? So it's a proof of stake blockchain. Something we've been talking about a lot lately, especially with the recent Ethereum merge. And so you can kind of think of Sui as, right, another L1 with the competitors being like Avalanche, Solana, Ethereum in general. But straight from their website, they kind of branded as Sui is the first permissionless layer one blockchain designed from the ground up to enable creators and developers to build experiences that cater to the next billion users in Web3, right? So a really massive focus on being cheaper and faster, right? With all the things going on with Ethereum, user empowerment, user experience, with those focuses on NFTs, games, really bringing individuals into the Web3 space, which is super exciting and honestly something that we talked about last week and a couple of weeks before that, where we were kind of discussing Web 2 and how that can kind of transition into Web 3 here moving forward. We need to make it pretty seamless and pretty simple for the average individual to, be utilizing Web 3, even maybe without even knowing it, right? The next piece would be currently they're right at about 160,000 transactions per second. We compare that to Ethereum, which is at 15, which I know we haven't talked a ton about. Kind of the next steps after the merge is sharding, which will obviously increase those transactions per second. But kind of more applicable, I would say, to Sui, being a Solana killer, right? Solana's at about 120,000 transactions per second at this time. So obviously, again, the focus is being cheaper, being faster, and that's going to be kind of their big differentiator other than aligning with that user experience and making it as easy as possible. But the last piece that's pretty important in regards to Sui is actually this horizontal scalability that I'm actually going to pass over to Evan to kind of discuss a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, appreciate that, Mata. It's, a different take on creating more speed in the network. Last week, we covered the ETH merge, where they're looking to move into sharding in future updates. And that's to basically create the throughput and the bandwidth of the network. This is how Sui is going to accomplish that, or their first take at it. With their horizontal scaling, they're able to spin up different servers within a particular node to scale the network horizontally. So you can, really handle as much traffic as the network needs. If you see a surge coming in, you scale the network accordingly. And then in those down hours, in those hours where you don't need every node, every server, functioning at top speed, you're able to wind them down. And, we're always talking about these ESG scores and these energy efficiency that's critical to get these big companies to come into the space. This is another way that you can improve the amount of energy your network is taking up. So, yeah, another really interesting part of Sui.
I didn't even think about the ESG impacts of that as well, other than, the speed. That's a really interesting bonus to that. So I appreciate that insight there.
Yeah, definitely.
We pop forward here. And so we won't go too in depth into this. So Sui, from a tokenomics perspective, uses a proof of stake mechanism. So it's really used to select, incentivize, and really reward platform operators. So like most of these chains, they do have gas fees. All network operations on the platform do require those gas fees, which are then rewarded to participants. I think the one thing we wanted to call out from this perspective, more specific to Sui, was the storage fund area, which we have boxed in red here. So the storage fund, in a super simple manner, you can kind of think of this as the fund used to redistribute past transaction fees to future validators. And the way we can kind of think about this is, so users will essentially pay fees upfront for both computation and storage. So the storage fees, which are collected, are actually deposited into a fund that's used to adjust the future shares of staking rewards. So this is really so that when there's a high demand for on-chain storage, validators will then receive additional rewards to compensate for their costs, right? And so when there's a lower demand, rewards will also be adjusted accordingly. I think Soham put this in a really good way. It's kind of like the surcharges on Uber or Lyft, right? When there's a high demand, they're going to go up a little bit more so they can compensate those individuals that are actually out driving. Very, very similar tactic that they're using here, and I thought that was an interesting way to go about it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, because I haven't seen any other blockchain really do that, where you're almost building in a mechanism to deal with like the ebbs and flows of the network traffic, right? So it's cool to see them doing that. Definitely, it reminds me of the Uber surcharge kind of mechanism, which makes perfect sense, right? When it's super backed up, you want to incentivize the validators even more. When the highways are clear, just let it go as usual. You don't need to pay the validators as much. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, just kind of like in a simple way to think about it is really just an adjustment for demand, right? Making sure that they're adjusting those rewards accordingly. But
and really quick, Mana, just another note on this. This is something where it feels like they're putting an emphasis on storage. Focusing on having developers really store a lot of data on this blockchain, and that's why they're having people be able to get funds from creating good storage for these developers. So there's an emphasis placed there, and some of the reason behind that could be this resource type that we talked about, that differentiating factor that they have between Solidity and Rust. Because something that I've heard is, with an Ethereum blockchain or a Solana blockchain, you have to sift through every block, every transaction to find the specific type or, a transaction where NFT is being moved from one owner to another. With this Sui blockchain, you're able to group transactions based on this resource type and speed up the, query or the search that's going to be needed to find that. So that's another advantage there is they're able to create more complex storage and more complex searching within the storage. And, maybe that's a reason why they want to incentivize better storage in their network.
Yeah, great point. I think it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I wonder if others are going to start to kind of pick up this piece of their tokenomics as well. But thought it was something that we should call out there before we get into the real bulk of this, which I know Alex is going to kind of take this one on. This is, I assume, what most people are kind of waiting for. So let's dive into this.
Yeah, let's dive into kind of this high level, and then we can kind of open it up and just chat through them. But really, there are kind of four key differentiators that stand out when we did our research on Sui. I think the first big one is the usability aspect, right? So their big argument is that blockchain infrastructure is not very usable, both from a builder and user experience side. If you think about how many hoops you have to jump through just to get involved in an NFT ecosystem or just to get involved on a separate blockchain or a separate protocol in DeFi. So they're talking about not only making it a lot easier from the builder perspective, being able to build on Move, but then also from the user perspective, it's supposed to become a lot easier with what you can build with Move. Like, for example, I saw somewhere in one of their white papers, they were talking about kind of doing what Starbucks and Polygon are doing, where you can have someone basically involved in a protocol or in a separate ecosystem and not necessarily have to have a wallet or have to have an account. And like you can do that retroactively or have Move do that automatically. I don't know where that's going to sit, but that's kind of just an example of that. One of the other big things is actually scaling horizontally. So being able to maintain and limit some of the costs for transactions, but then also obviously, allow for execution from a parallel standpoint as well. So that actually eliminates, a big bottleneck in terms of being able to handle a lot of transactions per second, since we're going to be organizing data into independent objects so that they can be executed in parallel. So those are kind of the first three. And the last one, which is huge, is the async process makes it more resilient to DDoS attacks. So this is huge when it comes to, Sui versus Solana, right? Because Solana, one of the big issues that they're facing is constant DDoS attacks. They've gone down multiple times in the last couple of quarters even. And so, that's kind of from a high level what some of the big kind of key standout differentiators are from something like a Sui and Solana.
I feel like that brings us to the question, right? The question really is this going to kill Solana? Is it better than Solana? Are people going to adopt it? What do you guys think?
I think the biggest question, like when we were talking about this before we got into it, I think the biggest question is how easy is this for Solana to replicate? So can they literally just move over to Move and like just migrate it all and just start basically doing exactly what Sui's doing? Or has Sui built something very unique and difficult to replicate that is just enabled by Move that, may be a little bit harder for Solana to follow?
Yeah, and it feels like there's a couple different pieces in their blockchain. You know, they separate their mempool from their consensus layer. They have a focus on these resources in their blockchain and have different advantages in the developer experience to be able to track, these resources. Or we didn't even talk about the transaction parallelism that can happen that speeds up the network even further with these resources. So it feels like it's definitely a step up from Solana in performance. Solana's got that first mover advantage. So who's to say those developers and users will want to hop back over? But there is some interesting technical challenges that Solana would have to get over to even, compare at that performance level with Sui.
Mata, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic points, right? Solana, in a sense, right? We always talk about Ethereum having first mover advantage, but Solana, in a sense, with keeping in Sui in mind as a competitor, kind of has the first mover advantage for this kind of new age L1 space. So they're really going to, Solana had to obviously compete with Ethereum and pull developers, pull investments away from them in order to kind of bolster themselves. These new L1s that are all coming out, not only do they have to compete against Ethereum, they have to compete against Avalanche, they have to compete against Solana, right? And so, they're on a good track, I think, right? They've got a lot of funding, they've got good backing from VCs, they've got awesome founders. They're all doxed, right? I talk about that as well. So they've got a good start. The question really does become, what sort of leaps do they start to take now that they've gotten this funding, now that they've, obviously, right, something comes out that they've raised this big rounds, right? That's how I found out about them. So when do they start being able to pull these developers, pull more money into the system, and have people actually operating on that chain? And I think, not just with Sui, right, but also with Move as a language is something to definitely keep in mind. A lot of these people who were using Solidity then had to move over to Rust for utilizing Solana and utilizing Near protocol as well. And so what's the appetite for them to switch languages again, right? So I think there's a couple things, and it's something to obviously keep an eye on as we move through this. They're out to a good start. I think they could be really the Solana of this next bull cycle whenever that actually does come about. It's just a question of, do these things line up in the right way, and do they put in the work in order to make that happen? But all great points. I think they've got great technology, great ideas. We kind of highlighted a few of them, and they've got ways to really bolster what an L1 could look like. And so whether or not that just ends up kind of being engulfed into, like Evan was saying, into Solana, right? If it's something that they can do, or Avalanche, something that they can do really simply, that's going to be really, really pivotal for them moving forward.
Definitely. All great points, fellas. I think the one thing that stood out to me right at the end there was the DDO, like the kind of defense against DDoS attacks. One of the biggest complaints that everyone has about Solana always is how they just like periodically just go down, and seemingly in just terrible times too. So that's something, we've talked about institutional money and institutions adopting crypto, and something that's keeping them away. So at least seeing that, in terms of how they're prioritizing that is definitely good to see. Armada brought up, the token and, going into the next bull run, whenever that is. It's important to note they haven't had their ICO yet. We will make sure on the channel to keep tabs on that and keep all the followers kind of involved. So as always, if you enjoyed this, make sure to like, comment, subscribe below to stay up to date with the latest crypto news. And till next time, signing off from the WAGME boys.
Later, fellas.
Later.